go. All right. Actually, I have to apologize for an untruth that I told earlier today, because my son was asking me, well, what's the apple for? Because I told him I was giving an apple lecture. And I explained, well, you know, New York is the Big Apple. And so I didn't realize it was an acronym, you know. So the first thing I'll do when I go home is to explain that I lied to my son, because truth is a linguistic question. Okay. So, whoops. Oh, whoa, don't get ahead of yourself. Okay. Actually, I'm going to talk about the implications of language diversity for diversity programs in universities, which may be a theme that's a little alien to you, but I think is absolutely critical. And this is something that we started before sort of the great diversity move of 2020. And when you look at it, so why does language matter on campus? Here's a meme. I don't judge people based on race, creed, color, or gender. I judge people based on spelling, grammar, punctuation, and sentence structure. Now, what that indicates, in a sense, is that the diversity canon sort of has a particular set of items that it focuses on, and with respect to those particular components, they're fine. But when it comes to language, it's an item that's highly judged within the academy. And I'm going to make a couple of pronouncements, which I hope to justify today. But one of them is this, and this is where this is going to be more than simply a talk about something. It's going to be an injunction for action on your part, okay? And that is that not only are universities complicit with language prejudice in higher education, but they're actual agents for its reproduction, which puts it in a very sort of precarious position as people who sort of are convinced and advocates of sort of linguistic democracy. As a matter of fact, this is a famous quote that's been around a while. Discrimination based on language variation is so commonly accepted, so widely perceived as appropriate, that it must be seen as the last black door to discrimination, and the door stands wide open. Okay. So that's the reality. All right. And I think that's also a kind of reality that exists in universities today. So I don't know, some of you may have seen this. I'm not quite sure how to start the video here. Does anybody know how to start the video? Huh? Click right here. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, so that's an ad that some linguists got together and convinced HUD to run on TV, which they ran about, 10 to 12 years ago. Actually, it's interesting because just the other day, I was driving around town and I heard a similar ad on the radio to that effect, which was basically the same ad that is still running 10 years later. And it's also, this of course is a case of linguistic profiling, you know, and this is a sort of simple definition. and it can happen in lots of different contexts, all right? And one of the interesting things is that they're estimated to be between 2 to million cases annually of linguistic profiling of this case, of this type, all right? And of course, it's against the law. Now, actually, just a couple of weeks ago, I finished a case in Iowa. Here's what happened. An African American from Milwaukee was driving through Iowa. He was stopped and he was booked for driving while intoxicated. Okay. So the basis, he would not submit to a breathalyzer test. You had that option in Iowa. And so the officer cited him for driving while intoxicated because he smelled like alcohol and his speech was slurred. All right. And so this was the case. All right. And I got a call from a lawyer who was the public defender in this case. And she said, you know, somebody said I should see a linguist. So I'm calling you. I don't know what you do, but can you help me? All right. So I said, yeah, I send the tapes to me. Okay. So she sent the tapes to me and I analyzed them. Okay. And here's what I found out, because one of the things I was doing was there, you know, people have studied speech during intoxication. All right. And so there are particular characteristics in terms of sort of the fundamental frequency, in terms of what sounds are changed and so forth. And so I compared the linguist's definition of the speech characteristics while language impaired, and then I compared them to his dialect, okay? He spoke a Black dialect, African-American vernacular. He deleted some consonants at the end of words. They were very systematic in terms of the patterning of that. He was R-less, as is often the case in African-American varieties. But one of the things I did not find is first of all, I didn't find changes in the resonancy. So it's supposed to go up, but actually his was very low. There were supposed to be changes in speed, but his speed was quite fast and it was not. And then when I looked at all of the sounds that were not standard English, every one of them was predictable in terms of his African-American vernacular dialect. And so I wrote up the comparison and said that whatever his speech was like, it was not indicative of intoxicated speech, but it was regularly predictive of African-American vernacular. So that was the basis of my deposition. And actually, as it turned out, he won the case and they dropped it, and that was the end of it. But the point I'm trying to make here, we think of sort of linguistic profiling in terms of, oh, somebody calls on the phone and they sound a certain ethnicity, and so we don't want to rent to them. But it's actually much more subtle and much more sort of pervasive than we think of. So in a case like that, a white rural police officer who has no familiarity with this variety because he never sees anybody who speaks it, simply assumed that his speech was an indication of his state of inebriation and therefore cited him for drunk driving. So we happily did win this case. You know, I haven't won every case and I haven't won any. The lawyers win them. But anyhow, it's an indication of how pervasive this thing can be. Now, here's an interesting thing about academics, okay? And that's the sort of what I refer to as academic prejudice. And there was an article in The Economist, a London-based newspaper. The collision of academic prejudice and accent is particularly ironic. Academics tend to be the center left nearly everywhere and talk endlessly about class and multilingualism. And yet, accent and dialect are still barely on many people's minds as deserving respect. Which in a sense says that although academics have lots of progressive agendas Language is not one of them that is typically endorsed. And that's something that we found. Actually, I want to go over here. I presume this is a gate here. At least that's what the picture said. I'm sure you know where it is. Okay, so it's a symbolic gate. And here's sort of the where it started. Okay, first of all, there was sort of exclusive power. So when schools were first designed, the arguments were sort of the university founders about elitist languages, you know, Latin and Greek. All right, so these were the languages. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't until World War II and the Veterans Act, where lots more people could go to college, all right, that sort of people were freed from this sort of elitist language, and then language became more of an issue. But there's a history of elitism in college education, whether it stems historically or whether it persists after sort of language became, education, higher education became more common in our society, all right? And the fact is that English language education is a reflection of that elitism. So that's what we're stuck with, all right? Now, all right, here's the deal about language diversity and university life. And here's what I'm gonna do, all right? What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna talk about two studies that we did at our university, about students' language and about faculty's language as well, all right? And this is going to be the support. So the first thing is that academics are gatekeepers, guardians, and authorities of the use of language, okay? The Academy provides models for students in the normative use of academic English, all right? Attitudes and behavior towards language diversity affect students' attitudes about themselves, the university, and participation in university life. And the fact of the matter is gatekeepers are in the best position to crash the gate. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say. All right, but I'm going to talk about my own personal experience because I grew up in residential Philadelphia in a grow house, all right, in a German community. Until I went away to college, I had never been 50 miles west of Philadelphia. And then I went to college in Illinois, all right? And I went primarily to play sports. I have to confess, basketball and football, all right? So I happened to play on an undefeated football team, which was the last undefeated football team in the college's history. All right, so that's significant because we had a 50th year reunion, all right? So we all came back for the reunion. And as we sat around, we said, okay, so what do you remember about these people from 50 years ago? Guess what they remember about me? I was from inner city Philadelphia, working class. They remembered I talked funny. 50 years later, that's what their recollection of me was, that I talked funny. And as a matter of fact, that was what they remembered about me. And then they said, well, you were pretty good in languages. I remember you're kind of smart, but you did talk funny. Right, 50 years later, in reality, I had no idea that I talked funny until people told me I did, because I lived all my life in North Philadelphia and hung out there. We didn't go lots of places because we had 6 kids, and my parents had an 8th grade education, and they didn't even speak English as first language. They spoke accented English, and one of the joys of that is nobody ever corrected me as a kid, which is, I guess, a good thing. Maybe it's not. I also, it actually gets worse, because when I went to graduate school, years later, my professor told me, he said, I have to admit, when I first met you, I didn't think you were going to make it. I said, why was that? Because of the way you talked. I said, what? Aren't you a linguist? Aren't you supposed to not hold prejudices about language? But that's what he told me. All right, so that's the sort of brutal reality of my life that I share with you. So, okay, so this first started when I had a student. College is a really interesting place because lots of people particularly in Southern communities, for the first time they leave their home community and they come to a central location. So for example, in North Carolina, we have a vast majority of people who are first generation students, and they come from all different regions of North Carolina. So I had a student, Stephanie Dunson, who decided she was going to do her dissertation on the perception of Appalachians in North Carolina State University, which is in Raleigh, which is in the Piedmont. And in the western part of the state, they still have very sort of Appalachian kinds of features, and most of the students bring them there. And it's interesting because most of these students, like me, never really experienced a lot of diversity until they went to college, and all of a sudden they met kids from around the state or around the area. And so she decided that she was going to study the speech of kids who came from Appalachia. All right. And so she studied 30-some kids. All right. Did interviews with them, charted all of their vowels to make sure that they were Appalachian English speakers. So she did a nice linguistic analysis and all of their grammatical features and so forth. But she also spent a lot of time talking about their experiences with language in North Carolina. Okay. So one of the things she said, here's a statement from her kid. I don't really speak up. She asked, well, do you speak up much in class? You know, I don't really speak up much in class and stuff like that unless I feel really comfortable, because I can hear, you know, people snickering or stuff like that when I talk. Okay. So that's a reaction, you know, that a person feels sensitive because they think someone is making fun of the way they talk. Now, in a sense, all of these things that I'm talking about sort of confront some myth, you know, and this one is sort of the myth that a dialect is something that someone else speaks. Just let me see if I can get to the, oops. Okay, well, we won't play. But actually, if you hear, what you would hear is that, okay, let me get back here a second. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. But other than that, life is good. Okay, so everyone speaks a dialect, and what you would hear here is, so we have 4 dialect productions. Okay, the first one of the word bought. The first one is bought. Okay, anybody tell me where that's spoken in the United States? The only place it's spoken is on the island of Ocracoke in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's actually tends to sound British. All right. The next one is bot. Okay. Now, in some areas of the United States, there's a collapse between bought and bot. So they're both pronounced bot. In Boston, a large part of the western part of the state. The third one is balt. All right. Which is a southern rural pronunciation. And the last one is bought, which is close to New York City. I happen to be from Philadelphia. People on the West Coast often ask me if I'm New York City, which is really insulting to me. No, it's insulting because it's indicative. If I'm from Philadelphia and somebody says I'm from New York City, come on, you got to know better than that. Well, people in California don't know better than that. So they're the ones who say these sorts of things. All right, but the point is that you can't use that word unless you make a dialect commitment. Okay, you got to commit to some regional variation in English. Okay, so then we have another statement here. Sometimes I think people think I'm not educated just because I have the accent. You hear a country accent and you think hillbilly, and then hillbilly, no education. So I think it's just like the social norm to think that way. Okay, so there are clearly sort of stereotypes, and we'll talk about the significance of a comment like that. About 6 or 7 years ago, I gave the first university talk on linguistic diversity at NC State. And a week before the talk, I was walking out of the hallway and I happened to eavesdrop this conversation taking place. I think a boy and a girl were flirting to the extent that I have sort of flirtation radar. But anyhow, so the guy says to the girl, Asians have weird accents. They use sounds that don't even exist. And she says, yeah, I know. What the hell? are you talking about? How can you use a sound that doesn't exist? You know, and I'm thinking, this is crazy. But they had this serious conversation about the use of sounds that don't exist by Asians. Okay, and I'm thinking, oh man, this university needs help. Okay, all right. So that was sort of a, this is something that happens pervasively around campus and so forth. Okay, so then we do a lot of research and we get a lot of publicity. And one of my colleagues, Robin Dodsworth, has done research on Raleigh's speech, and there's lots of interest in that because the migration of Northerners has changed and leveled out Southern dialect and so forth. And so there was a big article in our primary newspaper at that time about that. And it was in the Sunday edition. It was a nice article. And so I meet a distinguished professor in sociology at the red light crossing the street to get our lunch. And she says, well, I read the article in the newspaper, and that's not how old people from Raleigh talk, not if they're educated. And I thought, that's kind of weird, you know, that she's just sort of offered that opinion. And so what actually underlies that, all right? Well, first of all, she has an appropriated expert status, right? I mean, I would never say she did sociology of impoverished folks. I would never make a statement about impoverished folks because I don't know anything, but she knew about language. That's not how old people speak, all right? So she appropriated an expert status. And you may think that, man, that's kind of insignificant. But in reality, it happens all the time. People all over the place make these sorts of, as a matter of fact, when the great Ebonics controversy took place in the 1995, 1996, all right, I would spend an hour arguing on national TV with them. I remember arguing with a man who had a PhD in economics. We were arguing about language for an hour. Now, would I ever talk about economics for an hour with him? No. But he speaks English. He's an expert. All right. And so what we have here, it's sort of, well, if you speak the language, then you can pontificate about it. And so what she was doing was she was appropriating expert status, despite the fact that my dear colleague had measured over 10,000 vowels and was basing her study on very empirical kind of evidence. But she was saying, no, that's not how it is. I know, because I speak English and I've been around here for a while. Okay, so there's another thing. It's sort of like the trivialization of data. Like your data means nothing. All right, I know. And this is what I've found in a lot of discussions with people about language differences, that you don't have to study language to be an expert. If you speak it, then feel free. And then there's this sort of linguistic subordination ideology that she appropriates here, which is something that she sort of, so if they're educated, then they shouldn't talk like that. So what we see that our comment is not simply a trivial kind of thing. It's an indication of underlying sort of attitudes and ideologies. Okay, so here's what the student found, okay, in their study. First of all, with respect to course participation, that it affected by the perception of dialect. Speaking in class, comfort level, the kids didn't feel comfortable speaking loud because they would sometimes hear people giggling, okay? Another point was that it adds barriers to social academic settings, so that students who talk like this need to prove their intelligence, overcome stereotypes. So in a sense, with my professor, what I had to do was prove to him, I didn't know at the time because he didn't say anything, but unfortunately he confessed years later, you know, I need to prove that I was intelligent and overcome the stereotypes that people have about these sorts of things, you know. So it's sort of like look articulate while black, you know, saying someone is articulate, you know, despite the fact that they have a degree from Harvard at law school, you know, well, if they're white, Would you have to call them articulate? No, it only applies to black in a sense, sort of, oh, you don't talk like a typical black. You're articulate because we don't expect them to be articulate, which of course is crazy ass. Okay, so it also heightens the awareness of language stigmatization. So where they become a linguistic other. When you go to school, you've been come from a region where you've been speaking like everyone there, and all of a sudden you're in college and you have to make these sorts of statements. So here's what I did when I went to college, okay? Because people, including professors, would sometimes sort of ask me where I was from and why I sounded that way. So I found a guy who I really liked. He was a sociology professor. I said, okay, I'm going to change the way I talk. So I started mimicking him because I really liked him, all right? So he was kind of a good guy, and he was sympathetic to me. And so I tried to mimic how he spoke. And then when I came home for Christmas, my wife, well, she wasn't my wife then, but she's been my wife for 60 years. So she's been my wife a while. Actually said, Walt, why do you sound Southern? I didn't realize the guy was from Tennessee, but it was my norm. And so I was norming my speech on Southern dialect because I thought he was cool and he was a good model for me, right? You know, but really, I was just another kind of linguist. Also, there's a sense of belonging, sort of influenced by perception about dialect, accommodate or isolate. So when people from that region, they have a couple of choices. One is to stick with the people from the region in terms of their social life. Another is to change the way they talk. And people are now studying sort of how kids' language changes during college, because when they get out, they sort of have a new norm that is different. And so that becomes a sense. Now, the last thing is really kind of interesting, because what we found was differential experience. Here's what we found: that kids have different experiences in different departments, okay? Which doesn't sound that unreasonable. But here's one thing that sort of puzzled me. Basically, the students felt much more comfortable outside of the humanities and social sciences, okay? Now, why is that interesting? Because in most universities, professors in the humanities and social sciences, and there are lots of studies on this, are much more progressive than people in the physical sciences, right? And so these are the progressive people. But these were the people that the students felt most judged by. So in a sense, what it says is that being progressive can be very selective. So you may be progressive politically and on some issues, but you're very conservative about language, because people aren't even thinking of the implications of their attitudes about language, assuming sort of this mythology about standardized English. Okay, so that was a really interesting study, and I'll talk a little more about sort of what we did with it. So then we decided, well, let's talk about people who become professors. Sort of, so I sent out an invitation to a third of our faculty, and I got responses from over 80 people who said they would be interviewed, all right? So we then set up with all these tenure track faculty in this study. So the first thing we did was sort of personal language background, talking like an academic. So for example, obviously, I had no clue what an academic talked like, all right? But when I became an academic, somehow I socialized how academics typically sound. Although I've always been sort of a little out of it. You know, a dean at Georgetown once told me that he would like to come by my class and just listen to me talk, because I seemed sort of like to have this sort of working class dialect, but we're saying these profound things, and it didn't sort of fit his image. Okay, so and then we asked him about issues of language variation and use in their faculty and student interaction, okay? And then we asked them about like, how do you talk in the classroom? With your students and so forth. And then finally, we talked about the intersection of gender, ethnicity, and so forth, and university and the language campus. Okay, so we then, a couple of students wrote dissertations and a bunch of students wrote papers and so forth. And here's a statement by a Southern white professor, male. So he's talking about the students in his class. We asked him, so how do the students in your class talk? I mean, do some of them talk differently, and sort of what's your impression? So he starts talking about an African-American graduate student in the department. His speech sounds are very black. He's not altered his speech patterns like I see most of them trying to do when they come here. In fact, it's so much that he comes across very unprofessional. And I have a hard time, I would say I have a hard time treating him professional because he's so jivey in his talk. It's just street talk almost, the way he talks. And like he's throwing out big words and concepts, and like, how can you look and talk like this? Because you're really making it hard for me. Okay, so he's just sort of being candid about his impression. And so when we ask him about other students in the class, he says, yeah, I got this other student. So I got this, I had this woman in my class. So yeah, I think if I had this Midwestern voice that I would use it. So she comes from the Midwest, okay? I definitely would, because I always notice when someone has one. I pointed out to them, I did it yesterday. I teach her a seminar, so people teaching people how to speak right. And we had the Miss Western voice girl, and her diction was just perfect. And after she gave her seminar, I said, you know, you sound like a radio announcer. You could go into radio. I said, you've got that nice Midwestern. I said, perfect. It's just you beautiful. So, you know, use it. And I'm thinking, hey, surprised he wasn't reported for sexual harassment. You know, because he's, I'd say I'm a little overdone there. But anyhow, you know, that was what he said about this voice, you know. So he loved her voice because it was Midwestern, but the African American was quite different. All right, now, then there's sort of like issues related to solidarity. So we have some professors who sound very Southern. They've been in the South all their lives and so forth. So we're talking to a professor from Atlanta, and she sounds Southern. And I said, well, how about your students? How do they perceive you? And she says, oh, I think they like me. You see, I think they feel like, oh, she's from the South. She knows us. I taught undergraduates last year the first time in a long way, and they love me. I think it had this, you know, she's one of us. It really rings that I have Southern accent when I hear myself on video or television. I'm sure that's part of it. Well, for a number of years, I taught at the University of District of Columbia, a historically Black school in Washington, D.C. And one thing that Black students in Washington, D.C. did not like was Southern speech, because their connotation of Southern speech was prejudice, all right? And so she's being solid in her affiliation with white students, but how about other students who aren't from that area? Never gave it a thought, okay? So, and then we also had African Americans, all right? And so we talked to them, and they have a peculiar sort of situation, because they're a clear minority in most universities, all right? And so we talked to this one person. He says, I've been told by a couple of students over the other, I'm the first African-American person they've ever spoken to. And then I asked them, what has that experience been like? And they were just like, oh, it was enlightening. You know, you're so smart. You're so accomplished, you're polished. And so, you know, how I speak is really important to make sure that those students see how African-American people can sound just like you. Okay, I call that sort of the token representative stance, all right, where she's a Black professor. And one of the things that we found is that students can't imagine her having another variety, but in reality, in one of our Talking Black in America clips, what we show is a person who sounds totally standard, totally whitish in her formal presentation in the class. And then we show her talking to her mother and her best friend on the telephone. All right. And she has a different dialect. I knew that person. She was a colleague of mine for 7 years. All right. I never heard her speak that way. And so most of these students don't hear that and assume, and she's doing it because of this expectation. I don't want to play into their stereotypes. Now, things are changing a little bit as people sort of use that to use code switching to their advantage at this point. But in reality, what we're getting is a sort of imagined expectation of the way she should speak so as not to be stigmatized by her students. Okay, so one of our students did a paper with me on classroom chronotopes, okay? And he talked about two kinds of classrooms: the comfortably white classroom, where normative standard, unmarked English, okay? Then he talked about regional white language solidarity, and then sort of how Black speech is marginalized. So we saw that we saw that both in the positive and the negative, where the professor had this negative comments about the student. But we also saw a Black professor sort of doing that because Black speech was marginalized. She primarily just used standardized English. Okay, and then there's the uncomfortably Black classroom, where Black speech is non-normative and exceptionalized Black instructors and students. So what happens in these classes? And one of the real contrasts, I had a class this past year. I've been teaching at NC State 30 years. But it was actually sort of reasonably integrated. There were 6 African Americans, there were 4 people from overseas, and so it was a fairly representative class. Heretofore, that's a big word. Okay, I mostly had 1 or 2 African Americans in class. Okay, now I came from University District of Columbia, where all the students were Black, and occasionally you have a white student. So it was the reverse. All right, and what is interesting is that the past year, all of a sudden, more African American students were talking and leading the class. And in fact, many of the white people felt intimidated by it because they had never been in a class which had a sort of a profile of enough African American students to speak, rather than just one who had to speak as the representative or not speak. They typically didn't speak very much. But you see the difference that can take place when you have more representatives. Whereas the African American students, the white students tended not to talk a lot if there were 1 or 2 in, and the thing was reversed. So we have exceptionalized Black students, and then we have these linguistic subordination ideology. Okay, now, okay, and then okay, so I then had another student who wrote her dissertation on classroom chronotopes with respect to gender. Okay, so she focused on all the comments related to gender by the 80-some faculty members, and then analyzed them and put them into categories. So we have what is the comfortably white classroom, where normative standard, unmarked English. We have regional, language classroom flexibility. Basically, when I went into teaching, nobody ever gave me any pointers about teaching a class. They didn't tell me not to use certain dialect forms. Basically, I was on my own. They didn't tell me how to dress as a professor, right? So I had a lot of flexibility. They didn't tell me sort of to be discreet in classroom discussions. So lots of things they didn't have, and I had a kind of flexibility. But when we talked to the women about their experience going into classrooms, here's what we got, people would observe my class and they don't use so much uptalk, because it sort of doesn't make you as reliable, and watch out for the creaky voice, and when you teach, you can wear pants, but they had to be certain kinds of things. So they were giving them all kinds of advice about what to wear, how to talk. Whereas the men had a kind of flexibility. Nobody ever said, well, maybe you should be a little more reverent in class. They probably should have if they'd had more sense, but what can I say? So the male experience in the normative classroom is really sort of the unmarked norm. All right. And then and unmarked languages. Now, that'll wake you up. Oh, sorry. Was anybody sleeping? That happens in the middle of every lecture. Oh. It's a wake-up call. That's these two students of mine over here, former students. Doesn't that happen in every class? Okay. How come nobody told me? Your lectern's falling. Didn't you see me sort of gradually edging it to the extreme? Like that. Hey, it could have been me. Okay, so then there's a double-blind female classroom, all right, where nothing works when I click it. Where the technology goes off on females. Okay, there we go. All right, so there's sanction for indexing femininity. So sort of if you use vocal fry or uptalk and so forth, these are two sort of the major sort of stereotypes of that. So they get sanctioned for that. And then for sanction for violating gender norm expectations. So why don't you talk more like a woman when you lecture, all right? Which puts them in a kind of multiple social identities that intersect to produce unique privilege and oppression. And so their experiences coming into the classroom are very different. Their sort of classroom management in terms of language is quite different. And all of this sort of is a part of, in some cases, the overt and the covert socialization about these procedures. Okay, so what are we trying to do with these studies? All right, so we've done these studies. They're interesting, they're publications that 3 people will read. And so here's point number 1. Language variation is a critical symbolic manifestation of diversity. It is ironically excluded or erased from institutional office of diversity programs, okay? Now, as I said at the beginning, we have these components of things that are in the diversity program, and as I said before, they include sort of sex, gender, religion, ethnicity, and so forth. But by the same token, universities are central sites where linguistic subordination is reproduced and enabled. Okay, so here's what we decided to do. We decided on the basis, we went to our diversity office and said, look, we've done these studies and we found out these things, and we think the campus needs a sort of educational program about this. So we academically and interdisciplinary, we took sort of a cross administrative and technology. So for example, it wasn't just the linguist. We had a person in education and a person in the development office who worked with us, all right? So we weren't simply one department that is sort of making our position. and trying to foist it off on everyone else. We also had comprehensive audiences. We did programs for students, faculty, staff. So for example, while we don't have a union because we're in the South, we do have an organization of people who are service workers in the university. We did workshops with them. If you want to hear people who are subject to prejudice in their language, talk to them. And these are people who need to be told your language is good. Your language is who you are. Your language has a legacy. We also developed a student ambassador group for discussions, presentations, and workshops, which is recognized by the university, called the Linguistic Diversity Ambassadors, okay? And I think these guys were part of that original linguistic diversity, okay? And then we developed all kinds of resource personnel and online resources and for integration into the practice. So here's the point. So if you take something like language and gender, how can you study it without language? You need to sort of expose myths about language and gender. You need to challenge sexist and homophobic discourses. You need to recognize ways in which language influences gender and vice versa, okay? So here's what we've done over the last decades and so forth, but also we've harnessed for this program. We've done a lot of documentaries, oral histories, and so forth. We've done exhibits, everything from the state fair. At the beginning of the semester, we have a big exhibit where it has up to 100,000 people. Everybody's there. We have a booth. We give out buttons. We talk to people about linguistic diversity and so forth. We also have written trade books and popular articles. So for example, we have one trade book that has 130 QRs and it's written for the public so that they can learn about language diversity. We also have a curriculum that we developed for 8th grade students that is supported by the Department of Public Instruction, okay? Oops, sorry. And then we have media and social media. So for example, we have a YouTube channel that has 60,000 subscribers and over 20 million views, which is the largest linguistic YouTube channel of that type in the world, okay? All of which people can access. But we also have institutional programs, okay? So what you see at the bottom there is where we use branding. So for example, our mascot is the wolf pack, all right? So we designed something that said sort of how with an accent, all right? That's plastered over monitors around the school, all right? We talk about it in programs and so forth. So the value of engagement, and here for you of graduate students, all right? Because graduate students can be involved in these things in meaningful ways, such as my two students who are here tonight, all right? And research suggests that student engagement is a key element that influences student success, all right? Students are happier when they're engaged in stuff that makes a difference and not simply sort of focused on, oh, I work on this little area that I'm the only person who focuses on it. And it combines engagement with rigorous research, which has a synergistic complementary effect. Don't worry. That's just to keep you awake. Watch out, watch out. Glad nobody's sitting here. Okay. All right. So also experience and engagement broadens background for employment beyond the academy. We had several people who got jobs in private industry who used a lot of their engagement work, working with communities and doing projects with them that actually set them aside for other people. And here's a quote about that. Through participation in engagement activities, graduate students gain additional skills that may not be exercised in their dissertation research and teaching duties, such as overseeing budgets and so forth, practical stuff. Okay, so we did over 50 workshops, including the entire campus community. We go to dorms, which have regular meetings. We talk to different departments. We designed videos on language diversity. They're used in orientation for students, faculty, and so forth. The Linguistic Diversity Ambassador Student Group would once a month have discussions of relevant topics like language and ethnicity, queer language, foreign accents and discrimination, sign language, diversity, and so forth. Which, as a matter of fact, this week I know our film "Signing Black in America" was showed at a number of universities. My grandson is at a university. He said, "Hey, Pop, they're showing your film "Signing Black in America" for Deaf Awareness Day today. Isn't that cool?" Yeah, that's cool, man. Okay. I should say that I have 4 kids and 12 grandkids, and about 5 of them are in college now. Not one of them has ever taken a course in linguistics, but at least my grandson was impressed. Okay. So in our, for example, here's one of the things that the linguistic diversity ambassadors do. In freshman writing classes, we serve the whole university. Any professor can invite a student in to give a lecture on language diversity in their first year writing course, okay? Which helps orient students to sort of accepting diversity. And last year we had over 20 of those lectures that were given in writing classrooms, all right? And then we have a lot of online research. So I'm not going to show this, but this is a little clip of Signing Black in America. One of the things I do want to show is, we'll see if I can get this right here. Oh, no, I can't. Okay. How do I play this? This is a Mac oriented. So, no, okay. Yeah, I want to go back, but there you go. Okay, I want to play this and then talk about it just for a second. Okay. All right.
That's 2 chains. Call your girl, she hit me back like you rang. I'm the hottest thing you sang. Mental institutions asking me, is you saying?
You basic dude, you tripping. Lace your shoes, think again, deja vu. Play with me, you play to lose. Call your homies, they be the bravest fools. I mean, take the clues.
An individual's ability to speak spontaneously, authoritatively, in the vernacular is not only highly prized, but is literally used in verbal combat.
When you finish round 1, boy, you cast a stone. Look at the crowd, they eyes glued like they got lashes on in the draft zone. I'm with some mean boys, run up deep in the Jaheim voice. While you at the crib with your son watching Nickelodeon Teen Choice. You often throw a lot of negative shots at each other, and they're not necessarily genuine.
Your mama joke, you know, your cousin, you know, there's no boundaries, you know. I've heard all the type of jokes, all the type of like direct blazes, or somebody might call it blaze, and it didn't have to be like, you know, I hate you and boom, boom. It's just, we just battled with words, you know.
It's as much about the language itself and the connections that are being made as it is about like how the language, like how it's being delivered.
In Maryland, aiming at barrel, you rolling in flame, torching the game. Victor and here again, then I'll appear again. As much slang as we use in hip hop, there are probably more people that would have been English majors or writers in hip hop than there is in any other genre. Just the usage of words like metaphors, similes, double entendres, triple entendres. You might not even have a high school diploma, and you know how to use these things.
Okay, so here's what I want to say about that. Okay, we just had a colleague of ours who finished a dissertation at Stanford University, in which he did sort of neuron analysis of lyricists, that is spoken word and musicians, people who are artists, who are accommodating sort of like free speech styles, and non-lyricists. And what he found was a cognitive dissonance in the two that was statistically significant, showing that people who were good at freestyle actually had an advantage. And as he says, so if you're doing a job interview and somebody asks you a question and it's totally off the wall and you're not familiar with it, how are you going to respond? Who has the advantage? The point that he's making is that there's not something wrong with this. This is a cognitive exercise that people can use to their advantage. Sort of taking away this sort of stigma associated with these styles historically. What showing that that science actually supports these kind of advantages. Okay, so actually one of the things we did, and I'm going to stop shortly after this, okay, with some challenges for you, is we developed a video, okay, for student orientation, faculty orientation, and so forth. And let's see if I can play it here. No. Come on, dude, you need to sit here. You're wasting my valuable time. There you go. So the dialect of Warrington, it's a little different from here, huh?
Right.
So
Just like my friends, they don't know what a pack of nabs is.
can you hear that?
They call it a pack of peanut butter crackers. We call it a pack of nabs.
Well, most of my life I ended up coming back and forth to Raleigh, so I'm pretty adjusted to the accent. But a lot of people tell me I have a country accent.
Do you think you do?
Yes, but it's not indicative of Franklinton. I just have a different. My mama doesn't sound anything like me. It's just the way I talk, I guess.
When I got here or when I go somewhere else, people can tell that I'm from an urban area because I talk different, I guess, differently. It definitely is a different dialect because I guess there's a certain slang to our words that how we talk in Durham, so.
Where is Chapel Hill? You're on here?
Oh, we took Chapel Hill off.
I was actually born in Charleston, South Carolina, and then I went to England when I was 5.
So how do people react to your speech?
They don't understand why I don't sound like I'm from here, even though I'm technically from here and that kind of stuff.
There's quite a good mix of different dialects, you know.
But nobody who speaks the Ocracoke
I don't believe I've run into anyone with some brogue yet.
Hey, have a good evening.
When I came down here, I thought most people with Southern accents, there was only one sort of common Southern accent, if you can say that. And now that I've been here, I realize, no, there's very different kinds of dialects that people speak with different twangs, some of them more pronounced than others.
Kentucky is technically the South, and I have what some people would say is a Southern accent. I sometimes say that the mountains are on my tongue, and I think that if you embrace dialects, you're embracing people in different cultures.
I feel very strongly that language is a critical part of how we acquire and learn culture. And so to the extent that North Carolina State is an institution that serves all of North Carolina, and in that very broad sense, the language and the dialects and what you hear on campus is part of the vibrant sort of environment that makes this truly a university.
I think that supporting language diversity is one of the strong points about NC State. They always say, I love your accent, and then we'll go from there. So where's this accent from and things like that. Then I'll talk about Cameroon.
I have all 10 colleges represented in my world population and through prospects course in many, many countries. So we use the linguistic diversity in my classroom to build trust and confidence and respect, and it makes all the difference in the world by the end of the semester.
我来自北京，我在北卡罗来纳州立大学学习社会语言学。
Mi nombre es Daniel Marcelo Farfán Extremadoiro. Soy de La Paz, Bolivia.
It's fast, especially in my advice. I had problems getting almost half of what you were saying, but right now I'm good at it, and you can hear I'm also getting some of the accent.
Your dialect sort of depends on where you grew up at, and that kind of defines you as a person. But I don't necessarily think it'll define your goals or how you act or what you do.
Oh, Guilford, Greensboro, right here.
There are students here that, sound like a stereotypical Southern person, but they still attend the top university, and I mean, I guess that helps it out.
Yeah, they're still excelling, so
Yeah.
definitely, I guess it breaks the stereotype or says that, like, even if we are country or we're a farming school, like, we're the top. We are intelligent, so we're proud of that.
Born and raised in Hickory, North Carolina. Growing up, we were like the only Chinese family around. I teach English 101 here, so I get to teach students, like incoming first years, about language diversity and about dialects, and have them re-examine their own language prejudices. Language is a part of their natural lives, so it's something that they can readily talk about and, and embrace.
Issues of language diversity are really complex. You know, they're interwoven with other issues of race and sex and gender, and you know, they make up one part of our identity. And it's really difficult to try to tease one out from the other. And so since we have a general awareness that it's not right to discriminate against people based on sex, on you know, race, sexual orientation, these types of things, we're just trying to raise awareness that part of all these other identities is really tied up in the language that people use. And when we do discriminate against people based on their language, we're also discriminating in them based on their sex, their gender, their ethnicity, etc.
We're proud that we have students from all 100 counties in the state, and we're equally proud that we have students from 53 different states and territories in America, and we have students from 119 different countries. So literally, you can walk across this campus and experience a myriad of dialects.
Where else would you find this many people from so many different places in one little spot?
Where finding the natives is hard.
Yes, it's very hard to find the natives.
Okay. I just want to, I just want to sort of tell you a funny story about the chancellor. So, so I called him up and I said, Chancellor, we need a statement from you. And he said, okay, meet me over by my building in an hour or so forth. So we meet him. So he gets, so he, you know, he does the chancellor talk, you know, which is, so he gets to the point. Remember, he says that we have a myriad of dialects. Well, the first time he goes through it, he gets to that point and he said, I'm so proud we have a cesspool of dialects. And the camera crew looked at me and I looked at the camera crew. What do we do now? You just called the dialects a cesspool of dialects. And so when he was done, I said, Walt, did I say cesspool? I said, you certainly did. And I'm going to hold you accountable to that. So we had to do the whole thing over. And when he got to that point, he paused and said, a myriad of dialects, not a cesspool. No. Okay, so this is our brand that you'll see around the campus, because it's important to brand these kinds of things, and you'll still see these on hall room monitors and so forth. Now, okay, so here's the point. What we want to do is have symbolic inclusion of language diversity in the institutional diversity canon. We have seen here that we have a top-down administrative and bottom-up student support for linguistic tolerance. And we're trying to be recognized by the sort of, by the diversity program and their signature events. So what does this mean for Columbia University? Okay, here are my questions. How is linguistic diversity now included in the general diversity program? All right, is it included? Have you looked at it? Where is it? Okay. Oops. Secondly, is there a statement on language diversity included in the program, whether it's English program, ESL program, linguistics program? Like, for example, the University of Michigan has a strong statement about supporting diversity as a part of its as a part of its website. All right. And so what can be done specifically campus-wide with respect to education policy about language? You know, so ours is geared a lot towards dialect because that's what we get. But the University of Pennsylvania, sort of seeing what we did, went out on campus and talked to people and talked about different languages and their role on campus. All right. So we have to sort of fit this. And how can faculty and students be concretely proactive in this effort? What can you do? All right. And then finally, it's hidden by sort of the bottom line that I never got rid of, sorry. How can such things affect the university? So in a sense, what I'm saying is you're concerned with language and you're a little enclave of this university. I can guarantee you there are lots of programs at the university who really don't take a inclusive view about language in terms of teaching English, in terms of even teaching ESL, you know? So what are we going to do? And in that sense, what I would like to do is challenge you to do something about it that's appropriate for Columbia, that you can do with other partners, with the Office of Diversity and others. So that's my challenge to you. And that's why I say this is, whoops. When it drops again, I'm done. Okay, so that's my challenge. This is not simply a talk about what we've done and isn't that cool. The challenge is what's done here and how can you make a difference in terms of including language diversity in your program. So we have time for about 15 minutes for questions and so forth, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Yeah.
All right, I'll start off with questions. The first thing that comes to my mind is how much of this spirit and letter of the law has filtered upward to the dissertation committees, for example, where we're talking about academic written language and where there are standards that have traditionally been upheld that I would find very difficult to be breached.
Yeah, I don't have a problem not breaching those, but I do have a problem maintaining that this is somehow more valued than other ways of talking. And actually there is one group that really sort of favors more vernacular speech, and that is the group that works in agriculture around the state. And so those people in that office actually prefer that. So the problem is the issue is not with different registers. The issue is in the evaluation of the different registers and what they're indicative of, okay? So for example, here's one of the common myths that we teach 8th graders who assume that dialects are simply a collection of errors, as John Singler once said very well on one of our videos. We introduce these kids to the rules of dialects, how they work, how A prefixing works and so forth, how invariant B works in African American English. And actually, we've taught the same program, revising it for 30 years in the Ocracoke School. And we've gone back and asked them, what are the most important things you've learned? There are two things. One, dialects are really complicated. They have lots of rules, all right? What 8th grader around any other place of North Carolina would say that? Secondly, wow, there's a lot of prejudice about dialects. I'm not saying that we've converted them, but at least we've made them aware. And in the 30 years that we've taught this for 8th graders, we have transformed the island into an island that celebrates its heritage of its once stigmatized dialect as an important token of who they are and who they've been. So the point is not to say, well, we're not saying this is what you should write in your dissertation. What we're saying is whatever you write in your dissertation, understand that as a register that you're using, that is neither better nor worse. It is simply different.
But it is sort of universally regarded as being in some way superior, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is there's this notion that this is sort of the right and the only right way. When in reality, what we have to understand is that it's not about language per se. It's about the people that language reflects. And we have a good instance of that. I was just telling the students today, all right, in sign language. So sign language, Black Sign Language, in a sense, is linguistically more conservative in its format than white sign language. So for example, where white sign language may use one hand, they'll retain two hands. Or whereas white language has lowered its movement on the head, black language will keep it the same. So the reason for that is explained in sort of what was once sort of oral learning. Oral learning took place when people didn't like sign language anymore, right after, and as a matter of fact, sign language wasn't even acknowledged in the linguistic world as a language until the 1960s. Okay, so when they got oral language and they went away from signs, saying people should sort of look at cues and so forth, all right, that was only done by white people. Black people were not exposed to that. The black schools, they didn't think the black schools were worthy of learning that. And so what happened is they retained linguistically what would be a more conservative and standard form. Now, today, you look at Black American Sign Language and people say it's stigmatized. Why? Has nothing to do with this linguistics. It's because Black people speak it. And so that's what we're trying to combat and show that, you know, there's nothing inherently more linguistically valuable in standardized English. It simply has to be, it happens to be the register that is appropriate for certain things. You know, just like there's registers for things like polling sports programs and things like that. There are all kinds of registers that we allude to. And I'm not opposed to the registers that people use for PhDs, and I make my students abide by them as well. But at least they know that they don't have any more inherent value in terms of their symbolic function. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an opinion. Yeah, another question? Yeah. 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 Yeah, well, actually, in one of our earlier articles, which is entitled Educating the Educated, where we talk about this program, we do pre and post workshop testing and so forth. And so we see sort of the, you know, as sort of weak as sort of pre and post tests can be. But actually, one of the things that we did when we taught the program in 8th grade is we asked kids at the end of the year about the program, and they still had retained these sorts of things. So we have tested it and showed that to the diversity program that it makes a difference and so forth. But I didn't talk about that here. That's another paper. Yeah. Good question, though. Any other? Yeah. Yeah. So basically, we took our research and I applied for a diversity grant, not because I needed $2,000, because that wasn't going to pay for SMAC, but I wanted it to be, endorsed by the diversity program. So we went and talked to the diversity officer because they were giving us the money. And then we submitted our report, and then we submitted it to a national competition for and won the national award for innovative engagement. All right. And then we took it back to the diversity officer and said, okay, here's the research we did. Now what we want you to do, here's what we need to do, and we want your support in doing that. Unfortunately, that lasted for a couple of years. And then of course they diverge. Lots of universities have a high turnover in diversity officers. We won't get into that now. And so now we have a new diversity officer that we have to go to and talk to and train her. I don't want to say train in the sense of sort of a negative thing, but to acclimate her to what we have been doing and what needs to be sustained. Because it's not like you can do this for a couple of years. Oh, you've done it. you're linguistically equal. All right, doesn't work that way. You know, if you look at advertisements on television, there's a reason why you keep seeing the same damn advertisement, because the more times you hear it, that's what it takes to ingrain. So you have to market in a way that is repetitive, just like we've taught the same curriculum for 30 years. And after 30 years, teaching it every year to every 8th grader, you know, we have people finally convinced that this is right about their dialect. So it does take, then as a matter of fact, on Wednesday, I'm talking about the sustainability of this project. I'm speaking at the diversity conference. We have a big diversity symposium, and then I'm one of the speeches. And the diversity officer will come, but she may not like what I have to say, because I'm going to get on them for not sustaining it in a way that it's appropriate and needs to be. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, my feeling is there are selective academics who kind of get it, or at least know enough to tell you what you want to hear. But for the most part, we were surprised at how candid people were in some of their attitudes about the speech. Not thinking at all that his comments about the Black graduate student and the white graduate student, the woman from the Midwest, you know, that these were highly prejudicial kinds of statements about it, that people were just sort of unaware. You know, and my feeling is if I was talking to me, I probably wouldn't say that. but in a sense, that's one thing about language. People have a lot of sort of secondary or benign prejudice that is indicated and that they don't even think of to cover up. So, yeah, good question. Yeah. Yeah, we have a whole code book on things you can and cannot say, you know, in terms of interviewing people, everything from sort of like did you have a house where you came from, or, you know, or do you have kids? I mean, all those kinds of things are now potentially prejudicial, and we're not allowed to ask them. I mean, so I would be sort of hesitant to talk about language background in that context because of sort of the cautions that we now need. It's a totally different ball game in terms of interviewing candidates and what you can and cannot say. So I'm not sure I have that much more to say, because my hunch would be sort of talking about language with them would probably be verboten. Anything else? Yeah.
the real world, or is it at least of reality that
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, my long-term observation is that we need to introduce this into formal education, and it needs to be in K through 12. You know, and in order to overcome it, that's probably what is needed. I mean, we've done it in one pilot community. We've gotten great results and so forth. It's also a small community that knows us well, and we've known them for 30 years. And so that's a slightly different situation. But one of the things is that language is one of those areas that people don't have a lot of awareness of. You know, there's this assumption that it's something like math, where there's a correct answer and an incorrect answer. And it doesn't work that way, you know, and we need to raise the awareness. When people learn this stuff for the first time, we interact with them, I say, gee, I never thought of viewing language difference as a kind of legacy, you know, just like sort of the great musicians of North Carolina or the great storytellers, you know, we have these sort of language traditions from the different regions of the state. So what we try to do is raise awareness in the most positive ways, you know, ranging from sort of, so we have a 5-part series on Talking Black in America now that airs on, 3 of them have aired on national TV, and the 4th one will be coming up. And then we have a 5th one, which is on Talking Black in America, Social Justice, where we talk about sort of some of the issues of sort of trials and profiling and ways in which people are prejudiced, you know, speech and language pathology and stuff like that. So I don't know. We've not been particularly successful. While any teacher in the curriculum can teach our program, we've done webinars, online webinars through a series where we've trained teachers and so forth. It's not widely used. Our curriculum is not widely used in the state of North Carolina because everybody sort of has so many other options and things that they have to do that they don't realize, oh, there's a program about language and I don't need to be a linguist, but I can teach it. They just sort of have not sort of thought it. So, you know, we still need to work on this, but the more we get this information, look, I teach a graduate course, okay? Variety in language. I have a few linguists. I have anywhere from 25 to 45 kids in the graduate course, all right? First thing that I do is I ask them, okay, has anybody sort of had a class dealing with language diversity before now? Only the linguists and a couple of other people do. So less than 1/4 of the class actually has ever had any notion of this before they come to graduate school and take an optional course with me. So you know, we need education departments that insist that their students take courses in language diversity. They need to be a part of required educational courses. You know, so there's lots to be done both structurally and informally. You know, and what we found the biggest obstacle in many ways is sort of the structural nature of it. I wish I could have a, you know, more positive response, but you know, what can I say? So I'm going to die soon. So, so it's up to y'all to carry this work on. So please, don't make me look down on you with disgust. Yeah. Oh yeah. That's okay. We still like you. I know. Right. Right.
So I'm just curious, is ever got any
Oh yeah, actually, after that incident, Duke got a big grant from Carnegie Mellon to address that. And actually, just 2 weeks ago, I showed one of our films and lectured about it. So I've been a part of several of those things. But I'm gonna tell you a bad story about Chapel Hill now.
Oh,
Okay. We don't mind Chapel Hill. We don't mind Duke. We're sort of used to being losers to both of them. So you know, that's one of. But actually, people, I had some people at Chapel Hill who were very excited about what we were doing. So I went over and presented what we were doing. They developed a film similar to ours, you know. They took it to diversity office, and the response they got was, we don't have a problem with that here, so we don't need any education about it. But then again, folks at Chapel Hill know a lot more than we do at no. But what I'm saying, and one of the reasons we did this research was so we could go to the diversity in office and say, here's what the research indicates, you know, because our assumption would never be that a school would say, oh, we haven't encountered that problem, so we don't need to deal with it. But that was the response that the diversity office at Chapel Hill had to it. Yes. Yeah. Well, it is institutionalized, and actually sort of when I brought it up to the people at Duke about the incident, the response that they give to me, oh, that's not how it happened, Walt. So they haven't told me how it happened, but they said that's not how it happened. So you know, everybody it's sort of like everybody wants to deny they're a racist or classist, you know, and so yeah. But I actually, it's interesting because you bring up sort of some of the local controversies that take place in universities. So you would think, you know, and we have had some very good success of sort of like programs modeled after ours that have been adopted in places, but it's not a gimme everywhere. So, any other questions? Yeah.
What advice would you have for students who want to take on this type of project or implement
Well, what I would do if I were a student is get a group of students who have strong feelings about this and go to the diversity officer of the university and say, you know, we have a concern here. You know, is there anything we can do to deal with this concern? And say, you know, my feeling is I'm not anti-diversity officer. We want to work with our diversity officers about it. And so that is one of the things that I would do. You know, how can you help us address this sort of thing? So, you know, because lots of people in the institutions, including administration and so forth, are not really aware of the sort of covert kinds of linguistic prejudices that exist around the campus. So, yeah. Yeah.
So I am so pleased to be here. I really enjoy conversation. I'm Janice Robbins. I'm the vice president of there.
Thank you for coming. I told them to invite you.
I moved my personal life around. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, I'm honored that you came.
Higher education, and I am your TC Title IX coordinator. So I just want to thank you, and Aaron, right? And how you doing? No, I just want to say that we've been doing this work here, and we don't have diversity officers coming and going. is all that we do together. And our philosophy is that everyone has something. So we're trying to figure out if you've got ideas for it. We, as I think many folks know, that we also provide grants as
Right.
well. But it's not just giving away money; it's making sure that part of
Exactly.
what the efforts are that the students and others are going to do to make sure that. And so when we think about and talk about diversity here, our office is the vice president's office for diversity here at Canon. Although that's still, you know, it's still work, but it's work that is focused on everything at the college, and it's the office can't do it alone, right? All of us have to do it.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to any ideas or efforts that you have in this area. I also want to say one other thing. What you've done is really brought forth and identified the prejudices, right? That we have in so many different ways. But the prejudices stem from the systemic history.
Exactly.
And so until we have to continue to do that work in our different ways. We're all not going to be tackling it the same way or in the same area.
Exactly.
And so I try to encourage that. But the ability to be able to tackle this is be really aware of the systemic issues. And to your point about here and then going out to the world, the challenges that we see in Florida, Texas, and the undoing of our the curricula, it's not just happening there. It's going to spread. How we tackle all of this work and what we do is part of it. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Well, I wanted to thank you. So thank you very much for coming. I love the idea that you've been here long-term, because that makes a significant difference as well. And you sound like somebody who would be open and willing to work with folks, and I appreciate that. Thank you. So that's why I asked diversity officers.
Well, we hope to continue the conversation in the reception, so please feel free to make your way down the hall to each and one question, and let's move to the. So now, let's give another round of applause.
Thanks for having me.